Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today I'm going to be doing another makeup murder video. That's where I sit down, I do my makeup and I talk about murder or serial killers or some sort of like true crime thing. Last time I talked about Elizabeth Bathory, who was the most prolific female serial killer, and today I'm going to be talking about Dennis Nilsen. So I was inspired to make this video because David Tennant recently announced he is going to be starring in like a TV show about Dennis Nilsen, and he is going to be playing Dennis Nilsen, and I thought if anyone was interested in kind of like learning the true story before the TV show is on TV, then I thought I would just do it. And I thought I would look into what the actual true facts are, because I know a lot of things in TV shows can sometimes be like dramatized, so I wanted to see the true facts before I watch the TV show. So before I start, I just wanted to give a little disclaimer. This video is meant for educational purposes only. It involves topics such as sexual assault, necrophilia, murder of people, including children, so you have been warned. So Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Freyresburg, which is in Scotland. His mum was called Elizabeth White and his dad was called Olav Moksheim. His dad had adopted the surname Nilsen, which is why Dennis's last name is Nilsen. And Elizabeth and Olav ended up having 3 children together, and Dennis was the middle child. So his dad was actually a Norwegian soldier who had travelled to Scotland in 1940. Dennis's parents' marriage was a very, very unhappy marriage, and they actually divorced in 1948. Apparently Olav didn't really want to commit to marriage. They got married and he didn't really want to have kids, look after the kids. He didn't want to be there at home. He wanted to be out doing other things, and he didn't even like help Elizabeth find a house for when they got married. He just didn't care. Apparently, you know, he didn't take it very seriously, and as a result of that they split up, and Elizabeth took the kids to live with their grandparents. So yeah, from a very young age, I think Dennis was about 5 at this time, they'd gone to live with his mum's granddad. You know, they went to live there, and Dennis absolutely adored his granddad. Dennis absolutely loved being at his granddad's house. He had like really happy memories of being at his granddad's and going on long walks where Dennis would sit on his grandfather's shoulders and they would go for picnics, and he just recalls it as a really happy time in his life. However, on the 31st of October 1951, his granddad died of a heart attack while fishing. Dennis was only 5 years old at this point, and he was absolutely traumatized because this came out of nowhere. It was so unexpected. Dennis adored his granddad, so this was like really hard for him. And I think what made it worse was that at his granddad's funeral, it was an open casket funeral, and Dennis got to see his dead granddad, and that really like impacted on him for the rest of his life, like caused a lot of trauma for him. Dennis even said himself later in life that seeing his granddad dead in an open casket led to him having a really bad mental state. Before his grandfather died, Dennis had always been a quiet child, but he was still adventurous. But then after he died, Dennis was really upset. He was really withdrawn. A lot of the time he would go to the harbour where his granddad died, and he would just kind of stand there and stare out at the boats and just spend his time like watching the boats. Dennis refused to join in with any family activities. He would refuse any form of affection given to him by family members, even though Dennis grew up to resent how much affection his mum and his grandfather and later stepfather would give his other siblings. He was, you know, he thought this was unfair, but whenever they tried to give him affection, he would refuse it. I feel like he's just like a typical teenager for that though. Like when you're a teenager, you want your family to love you obviously, but you're just like, oh no, stay away from me, I'm too cool for that. So one time when Dennis was out at the harbour watching all of these boats, he actually fell into the water and started drowning. He was almost dragged out to sea. He was pulled under the water and he couldn't breathe. And for a second, Dennis actually thought he saw his grandfather coming to pull him out of the water, and Dennis felt like he was at peace. But it wasn't his grandfather, it was just a young boy who came and pulled him out of the water and saved his life. Dennis really got on with his sister Sylvia. They would play together a lot of the time. That was probably the only family member who he really got on with. So his mother eventually moved out of living with her parents and she got a place of her own. And she actually later married a builder called Andrew Scott, and they ended up having 4 more children together. And at first, you know, Dennis really did not like his stepfather. He almost resented him, but later he began to respect him a little bit more. In 1955, the whole family moved to Stricken, which is another little town in Scotland. And around this time, Dennis was starting to go through puberty and he began to realise that he was gay. This confused Dennis a lot and he was actually quite ashamed of it. He obviously didn't tell any of his family or his friends about this because he was worried of what they would say. He did find, however, he was getting attracted to boys who had similar features to his sister, Sylvia. So Dennis thought a way to cure himself would be to sexually touch his sister. He genuinely thought like his attraction to men was just a manifestation of his care towards his sister. There's literally incest in every single one of these stories, I swear to God. He wouldn't have sexual relations with any of his like peers, but one time apparently he was fondled by another like youth and he said it was a very enjoyable experience. One time Dennis fondled his brother when he was sleeping and his brother woke up and, you know, started to think Dennis was a homosexual for this. As a result of this, apparently his brother would belittle him in public and would refer to him as a hen, which is apparently a Scottish slang for girl. Dennis grew up and was slightly ashamed of his family because he realised they were quite poor. He would never invite his friends over to his house because he was embarrassed because his friends were all like richer than he was. Dennis also was really annoyed at his mum and his stepfather because they were poor and they weren't like trying to get better jobs. They weren't trying to make themselves less poor. I think this really like started a certain mentality in Dennis. From an early age, he was working, he wanted to earn money, he wanted to live a good lifestyle, I suppose. When Dennis was 14 years old, he actually joined the Army Cadet Service because he thought being in the army would be a good career. And at school, Dennis was a talented individual. He really excelled in like maths and English and history. But he wasn't so great at things like sports. Honestly, can relate. He finished school in 1961 and then straight from there he went to work in a canning factory just to earn some money. He also worked at this canning factory to kind of figure out what he wanted to do. He was like, well, I'm going to work here for a little bit and then I'm going to really decide what I want to do with my life, what my next career move is. 3 weeks into this job, he had decided what he was going to be and he went and told his mother he was going to work in the army as a chef. Dennis passed the entrance exam to the army and he got an official notification that he was to enlist for 9 years service in September 1961. And while Dennis was in the army, he excelled. He absolutely loved it. Dennis actually described being in the army as one of the happiest times in his life. He loved that he got to travel with his work. He literally got to see like so much of the world through being in the army. While he was there, he was starting to have some intimate feelings towards some of his colleagues, which he was pretty ashamed about. He didn't say or do anything about these feelings because he was worried that people would start to hate him and make fun of him. He even went as far to never shower with his colleagues. He would always shower alone because he was scared he would, you know, get an erection when he was showering. In mid-1964, he passed his catering exam and was sent to Germany. While he was there, he served as a private, which is the lowest rank you can be in the army. During his stay in Germany, his alcohol intake started to rise dramatically, and he would describe himself and his colleagues as a hard-working, boozy lot. And he would mainly drink to ease his shyness. He was a shy individual and, you know, he wanted to make friends, so he would drink alcohol to kind of give him some sort of confidence boost. One time, Jenny? Who's Jenny? One time Dennis and this German youth drank themselves unconscious, and Dennis woke up on this boy's bedroom floor. Nothing had happened at all, but Dennis started to have these fantasies about like what could have happened, and he started to like, you know, imagine sexual things. So in these fantasies, Dennis would imagine himself with tall, slender men, and in these fantasies, all of the men were either dead or unconscious. Sometimes Dennis would pretend to be passed out drunk when he was drinking with his colleagues in the hope that one of them would touch his body or have their way with him. He was then deployed as a cook to Norway. In 1967, he was deployed to Al Mansoura prison, which was in Yemen. Now, this place was a lot more dangerous than any other place he had been deployed. One time, Dennis was actually kidnapped by a taxi driver, and he was locked in the boot of this taxi, and then when Dennis was let out, when the guy opened the boot, Dennis basically beat this guy with a jack handle, and then he knocked the taxi driver back into the boot, and Dennis, you know, got away. In this new place as well, Dennis actually had his own room. In previous places he would have like shared lodging, but in this place Dennis actually had his own room, which he very much enjoyed. He would masturbate a lot in this room. He would continue these sexual fantasies that I talked about before, you know, the dead people. There was also a mirror in this room, and Dennis would position it in such a way that he could see his body, and he would pretend that his body was like an unconscious body. Anyway, after serving in Yemen, he returned to the UK, where he served for a little bit in Plymouth. When he was in Plymouth, he was required to cook for 30 soldiers and 2 officers daily. And he was there for 2 years before he was deployed to Cyprus in 1969. A few months later, the regiment that he was working with was transferred to Berlin, and this is where Dennis actually had his first female sexual encounter. He ended up having sex with a prostitute that he completely solicited himself, and after it was over he went and bragged to his colleagues about it, you know, being like, yeah, I just had sex with a prostitute. But in fact he did not enjoy this experience, and he described it as overrated and depressing. After working in Berlin, he briefly worked in Inverness, where he actually cooked for the Queen's Royal Guard before in January 1971 he was reassigned to the Shetland Islands. He then ended his 11-year military career at the rank of corporal in October 1972. Between October and November 1972, Dennis went back to live with his family, as he was basically planning his next career move and what he wanted to do. When he was back home living with his mum was unhappy with his lack of female companionship. His mum really wanted him to get married. One night Dennis was actually sat down watching TV with his family, and they ended up watching a documentary about male homosexuality. Dennis spoke up about gay rights and about how he believed in them, and this caused a massive argument in his family. His brother was very homophobic, and you know, him and Dennis had this massive argument, and after that he never saw his brother again, and he only maintained a written contact with his mum and his stepfather. He was kind of done with that family at this point. Dennis decided he was going to join the police force, so he moved to London to start his training. In 1973, Dennis actually had his first brush-in with the police. There was a guy called David Painter. He was a young man who Dennis had met through his work. He claimed that Dennis had taken pictures of him while he was asleep. Dennis was taken in for questioning about the incident, but nothing like really went further, and you know, it was just forgotten about. In April 1973, Dennis finished his police training. He was a junior constable, and he got to perform like several arrests, but he never had to subdue anyone. They were all pretty straightforward arrests. He enjoyed working as a police officer, but he just missed the army. He would spend most of his evenings like in his flat, drinking alone. In summer, he would, you know, he started to go out a little bit. He would frequent gay bars, and he would have casual liaisons with men. He saw these like hookups as soul destroying and a vain search for inner peace. He really wanted a lasting relationship. So in August of 1973, Dennis had just come out of another failed relationship, and he was getting like pretty upset at this point. He decided that his job was interfering with his personal life, and his birth father Olav had recently died, so left Dennis and his other children £1,000. So in December of that year, Dennis resigned from the police force. Between December 1973 and May 1974, Dennis worked as a security guard. The work wasn't really consistent, it was quite intermittent work, and Dennis was really looking for something that was a bit more stable. And he ended up finding work as a civil servant in May 1974. So this job consisted of him finding employment for unskilled labourers. He was known as a quiet and conscientious employee. Apparently his attendance record was somewhat mediocre, but he was always willing to work overtime. In 1979, he was actually appointed acting executive officer, and then in June 1982, he was promoted to executive officer. He continued doing this job until his arrest. So we've talked about his working life, working in the army, the police force, all stuff like that. We're going to actually get into some of the murders now. So in 1975, Dennis took up a cohabitation with a guy called David Galichan. This was a garden apartment situated at 195 Melrose Avenue in North London. Even though they cohabited together, David, he insisted that him and Dennis didn't have any homosexual relations. So yeah, this lasted 2 years that they were together, and then David left, and then Dennis's life kind of started going in a downhill spiral. He would like decline into alcohol and loneliness. Dennis was so desperate for love and attention, like all the way throughout his life. He just wanted like someone to love him and be there for him. Between 1978 and 1983, Dennis is known to have killed a minimum of 12 men and boys, and he is known to have attempted 7 other murders, but he wasn't successful with those. Dennis's first victim, I'm going to briefly talk about the majority of the victims, so bear with me. Dennis's first victim, he was called Stephen Holmes, and he was 14 years old. On the 30th of December 1978, they met in Cricklewood Arms pub. Stephen had gone in and he had attempted to purchase some alcohol, and you know, he was refused service because he was under 18 and, you know, it's illegal. And Dennis had apparently been drinking in his flat alone all day, and he went out to this pub because he was like, I need to get out, I need to not like be drinking on my own. So he goes out to this pub and he meets Stephen, and he invites him back to his house with the promise of some like alcohol. Dennis apparently thought Stephen was 17 years old, which is still kind of like a bit weird, but you know, he didn't think he was 14. So what happens is they go back to Dennis's house and they drink and they listen to music until they pass out. Dennis was apparently scared to wake Stephen, because when Stephen would wake up, he would leave Dennis and Dennis would be on his own. So he decided, it was the 31st of December at this point, he was like, I really want someone who's going to stay with me into this new year. So he strangles Stephen to death. Oh wait, no, he didn't strangle him to death, sorry. Stephen woke up immediately and they struggled and Stephen went unconscious. Dennis then drowned Stephen in a bucket. He didn't strangle him to death, he drowned him in a bucket. He then masturbated twice over his body and just put him under the floorboards. He left his corpse there for over 8 months until the 11th of August 1979. He burned it in his garden with a bonfire. He would do this a lot over time, and to disguise the smell of rotting flesh, he would also burn like old car tires, so that was like what people would smell. Dennis ended up having another close call with the police in October 1979. A young student claimed Dennis had tried to strangle him to death, and the police went and questioned Dennis, but they kind of just assumed this had been some weird like sex bondage thing that had gone wrong, so they just like left it. On the 11th of October 1979, Dennis attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong called Andrew He. He'd met Andrew in a pub again. He usually meets people in pubs, there's a few exceptions, but he would frequent pubs, so he'd meet a lot of people in pubs. He led Andrew back to his house with the promise of sex. He attempted to strangle Andrew, but Andrew luckily escaped, and he went to the police, and Dennis was questioned about it again, but nothing happened. On the 3rd of December 1979, Dennis met a Canadian student called Kenneth Ockendon. I'm sorry, I'm so bad at names. So they drank together for several hours, they went on a tour of London, and eventually they ended up at Dennis's flat, and they just drank together. So Dennis got on really well with Kenneth. He really enjoyed his company with him. And this led Dennis to having abandonment fears again. Kenneth was going to be going home, I think. He was like flying somewhere the next day, so Dennis was like really upset that Kenneth was leaving him. He ended up strangling Kenneth with an electrical cord, and then took all of his clothes off and then put him in his bed, and Dennis slept with him. He also took photos of his body, and then he put the corpse once again underneath the floorboards. He would also sometimes bring out the corpse and have conversations with it as if it was still alive. His next victim was called Martin Duffy. Martin was 16 years old. So in May 1980, Dennis met Martin, and he was a homeless guy. Dennis got Martin to come over to his house with the promise of some beer and somewhere to sleep, and Martin obviously like accepted this offer. He had 2 beers and then he went to sleep. Dennis then climbed on top of him, trapping his arms under the covers, and strangled him. Martin went limp, but he was still alive, so Dennis once again took him into the kitchen and drowned him. He then took him to the bathroom and got in the tub with him, and then he put him on like a kitchen chair, and he just kind of left him there for a little bit. He would often caress his body and like kiss him. He was in just like Dennis's cupboard for a couple of weeks, and then after that he was placed once again underneath the floorboards. So then after Dennis had killed Martin, Dennis was kind of on like a killing frenzy. He really began to kill with much more intense frequency. So he killed 5 more people, and he attempted to kill another. His next victim was 27-year-old William or Billy Sutherland. Billy was a prostitute, and Dennis once again strangled him to death. Apparently Dennis had absolutely no recollection of this murder. When he like realized that Billy was dead, Dennis was genuinely concerned. He was like tempted to phone like the police and be like, this guy has just died, but then realized he was the one who had actually strangled him and killed him, but he just couldn't remember it. In August 1980, Dennis asked a guy called Douglas Stewart back to his house. Douglas ended up falling asleep in an armchair, and when he woke up, his like legs and feet were like tied up, and Dennis was putting like a necktie around his throat. Douglas actually ended up fighting Dennis, and Dennis ended up just telling him to leave, so he got away. Obviously Douglas went straight to the police and they questioned Dennis, but again nothing happened. They just assumed that there was a misunderstanding. Between November 1980 and May 1981, Dennis killed 7 men, and these men were never identified. Dennis couldn't remember who they were. Dennis couldn't even remember the murders. He would have these episodes where he would just like black out and literally couldn't remember even killing people. So these 7 men, they were just never identified. So at this point, Dennis has got quite a lot of bodies underneath his floorboards, because Dennis had this thing with like abandonment issues, so he would keep his victims with him in his flat. And obviously his flat was starting to absolutely stink of decomposing bodies. He would go and check on the bodies, and he would see like all of the bodies decomposing, and there were like maggots all over them. Dennis even said he saw some maggots crawling out of people's like mouths and eyes. So to combat these horrible smells and stuff, Dennis would spray deodorant beneath the floorboards, and twice a day he would spray insecticide. Obviously, this did nothing, the horrible smells remained, and it was getting pretty intolerable. So in late 1980, Dennis actually removed and dissected each body of the victim that he'd killed since December 1979. He cut them up and he burned them in a bonfire again. He would burn old car tyres with them so the smell was masked. Afterwards, he would take a rake and he would rake the ground to make sure there was no bones intact. Like one time he found a full skull that was still completely intact, so he smashed that up and then he would scatter the remains and ashes everywhere. On or about the 4th of January 1981, Dennis met a guy in a pub, but he didn't know his name. They participated in a drinking contest and then they went back to Dennis's home. Dennis strangled him and then put him underneath the floorboards as well. Dennis ended up phoning in sick to work on the 12th of January of that year, basically so he could cut up the bodies that he had underneath his floorboards. By April, Dennis killed 2 more unidentified bodies. One he described as an English skinhead and another he referred to as Belfast Boy. His final victim to be murdered at the current place he was living was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow. Dennis had discovered Malcolm slumped outside his house, against his wall. Malcolm had epilepsy and had a fit, and it caused him to be really weak and he couldn't move his legs. So Dennis ended up calling an ambulance for Malcolm, where he was taken away. Later that day, Malcolm returned to Dennis's house to basically say thank you. Dennis invited him inside, and apparently Dennis described Malcolm as a nuisance. They ended up drinking together until Malcolm fell asleep. Dennis strangled Malcolm to death and then stuffed his body underneath the kitchen sink. At this point, he was sat in his flat with half a dozen other bodies, just awaiting disposal. Some of the bodies Dennis would keep in bed with him for sexual purposes for as long as a week. And in 1981, Dennis's landlord basically decided he wanted to renovate the building that Dennis was staying in. So obviously Dennis was asked to vacate the building. Dennis was obviously really sad about this because he kind of enjoyed living there and it had a lot of emotional attachment to him, I suppose. At first he refused to leave, but I think the landlord offered him £1,000, or he offered him some sum of money, and then Dennis eventually ended up leaving. The day before Dennis left his flat, he actually dissected and burned the remaining bodies and, got rid of the evidence. From then on, Dennis ended up moving into an attic flat of 23D Cranley Gardens on the 5th of October 1981. So this house had no access to a garden like the last house did, so this meant Dennis wouldn't be able to burn any bodies that he would kill. He also lived in the attic flat of the building, so he wouldn't even be able to store the bodies underneath his floorboards, so he was kind of what am I gonna do? For 2 months of living in this new place, Dennis didn't assault or murder anyone that he would bring back to his flat. He was trying to resist his urges as much as possible. At one point, he attempted to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs on the 23rd of November 1981, but he kind of stopped himself from doing it. In March 1982, Dennis encountered 23-year-old John Howland. Again, John was just drinking in a pub that Dennis was in Leicester Square, and then Dennis asked did he want to come back to his flat with the promise of more alcohol. So they drank and they watched a film until John fell asleep. Dennis then strangled John until he was unconscious and then took him into the bathroom and drowned him. So Dennis did obviously kill people in this flat. He didn't stop killing people, but he couldn't burn them like I said, and he couldn't hide them under his floorboards. So what he started to do is he would cut up these bodies and he would boil parts of their bodies in a pot and his kitchen stove to kind of get the flesh away from the burn, and then he would either dispose of some of the flesh down the toilet. He would just flush it down the toilet, or he would wrap it up in plastic bags and just keep it in his cupboards. In May 1982, Dennis encountered a 21-year-old guy called Carl Sotter. He again met him in a pub in Camden, and he found out that Carl was really depressed following a failed relationship. So Dennis invited him back to his flat and they had some drinks, and then Carl fell asleep in a sleeping bag. When he woke up to Dennis on top of him, strangling him, saying, "Stay still." For a moment, Carl genuinely believed that Dennis was trying to help him, like he was stuck in the sleeping bag and Dennis was trying to like help him out of the sleeping bag. Anyway, Carl went unconscious. When Carl woke back up, he was actually in Dennis's bathroom, and Dennis was trying to like push his head under the water and was trying to drown him. At this point, Carl was almost dead, but not quite, and he remembers pushing his head under the water, and he came up for a breath of air and was just like, please no more, just stop, and Dennis just pushed his head back under the water. Then Carl woke up and he was in like an armchair, and Dennis was like rubbing his body and was putting blankets over him and was saying, you got caught in your sleeping bag and you got strangled and I was trying to save you, and then you were in shock, so I put you in some cold water, like you nearly died, I saved your life. Dennis looked after him, made sure he was better, and then he took him to a railway station and said goodbye. Dennis encountered 27-year-old Graham Allen attempting to hail a taxi in 1982. Dennis ended up asking Graham if he wanted to come to his house and have a meal with him, like he did with a lot of people, would entice them with alcohol or food. So Dennis was eating an omelette with Graham around, and that's when he decided he was going to murder Graham. He also didn't remember any of this murder, but Graham's body was retained in the bathtub for a total of 3 days before Dennis began the task of dissecting the body. On the 26th of January 1983, Dennis killed his final victim. This was 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair. So Dennis, you know, had Stephen at his house and he drugged Stephen with a concoction of alcohol and drugs. He then strangled Stephen with a necktie and rope until he was dead. He slept with the body, once again like he had done with so many of his other victims. He dissected the body, he wrapped parts of his body in plastic bags and stored them in either a wardrobe, a tea chest, or within a drawer located beneath his bathtub. And he took the other remains and he flushed it down the toilet. And that was Dennis's last victim. So after all of that toilet flushing business, you know, human parts gone down the toilet, the drains to the house were obviously starting to get a little bit clogged and a little bit stinky. On the 4th of February 1983, Dennis himself actually wrote a letter to the estate agents complaining about the smells of blockage of the drains. For himself and the other tenants, the smell was just intolerable. So there was a company called Dynarod, which is a plumbing company, and they came to inspect the plumbing complaints and see like what the issue was. So an employee came out called Michael Catran, and he took the top off the drain pipe and discovered that the drain was packed with flesh-like substance, and then he also saw that there were like numerous burns of unknown origin. He was just kind of like a bit freaked out. So Michael reported these findings straight away to his supervisor called Gary Wheeler, and it was getting pretty late at this point. It was like dusk, so they decided they would come back the next morning and they would like, you know, properly sort it out and have a proper look at it. So 7:30 a.m. the next day, they returned and they noticed that the drains had been cleared of all of the flesh. So this instantly made the men very suspicious. They were like, why? What? Michael discovered a few scraps of flesh and 4 small burns in a pipe leading towards Dennis's attic flat. So they immediately called the police because they were like, this is suspicious. And Michael was kind of a little bit worried that the burns had come from a human hand. They were really small burns, and he was just like, I'm getting bad vibes from this. So they took the burns to a mortuary where it was tested, and they revealed that they are actually human burns from the neck. So the police, DCI Peter J and 2 other colleagues who were like health inspectors, they went to Dennis's house and, you know, they waited for him to return from work, and when he did, they were like, cool, can we come in, we've got a few questions for you. Dennis allowed them access to his flat, and they immediately noticed the odour of rotting flesh as soon as they walked into his flat. Dennis asked the police officers, why are you interested in my flat and talking to me when, you know, if this is just a problem about the drains? And the police told Dennis that there had been remains of human remains found in the drains leading to his flat. Dennis apparently pretended to be really shocked at this, and he was like, oh my goodness, what? But the police were having none of this, and they just asked Dennis, they were like, you know, where's the rest of the body? And Dennis really calmly was just like, okay, yeah, they're in the other room. Dennis was super calm about the whole thing. He just straight up confessed and was like, yeah, the remains are in the other room in 2 plastic bags. They asked if there were any other body parts to be found, and he just replied saying, "It's a long story, it goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything, I want to get it off my chest, not here at the police station." So they got Dennis in a police car and they were driving him to the police station, and the police asked if the remains were from 1 person or 2. Dennis was just looking out of the window and just calmly said 15 or 16 since 1978. And at this point the police were like, what? So they got access to Dennis's flat and they found bags in his flat that had body parts in them, which were all obviously taken to the mortuary. So one bag was found to contain 2 dissected torsos, one of which had been vertically dissected, and there was a shopping bag containing various internal organs. The second bag contained a human skull almost completely devoid of flesh. There was also a severed head, there was a torso with arms attached but the hands were missing, and both heads were found to have been subject to moist heat, so they were pretty nasty. In an interview conducted on the 10th of February, Dennis confessed there were even more human remains stored in a tea chest in his living room and other remains in an upturned drawer in his bathroom. He admitted every single one of the murders he'd done. He even mentioned the 7 men that I talked about, but he couldn't remember who they were. He even talked about his old address, saying he'd killed about 12 to 13 people there, and he was really forthcoming with information. He was really just like willing to tell the police everything, like he'd been found. He didn't see the point in lying. So a further inspection of his house on the 10th of February revealed the lower section of a torso and 2 legs stood in a bag in the bathroom. There was a skull, a section of the torso and various bones in the tea chest. And at 5:40 p.m. on the 11th of February, Dennis Nilsen was arrested officially. So the formal questioning could begin, and it went on for 16 separate occasions, and it lasted around 30 hours in total. When the police asked Dennis, like, why did you do this? His response was, "I'm hoping you will tell me that." Dennis was completely adamant he did not have a desire to kill until literally a few moments until he had killed people. Like, he couldn't even remember what had happened. When Dennis asked if he had any remorse for his crimes and what he had done, he said, "I wished I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." He also clarified he didn't get any pleasure from killing, but appreciated the art of death. So when Dennis was in jail awaiting his trial, he refused to wear inmate clothing and he said he would wear nothing. Therefore, Dennis was confined to his cell, he wasn't allowed to leave, and then on the 1st of August, he threw the contents of his chamber pot out of his cell and it hit several officers. This incident resulted in Dennis being found guilty on the 9th of August of assaulting prison officers and subsequently spending 56 days in solitary confinement. On the 26th of May, Dennis would stand trial on 5 accounts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. A 6th murder charge was later added. Initially, Dennis was going to plead guilty, but he changed his mind and pleaded not guilty 5 weeks before his trial for diminished responsibility. That refers to his mental state not completely being there, so he wasn't responsible for his crimes. So he was brought to trial on the 24th of October 1983. The trial began asking if Dennis wanted to plead guilty or not guilty, and he chose not guilty. Dennis kept on saying his mind wasn't fully in control, so it wasn't murder, it was actually manslaughter. So on the 25th of October, the court heard testimony from 2 further men who had survived the attempts by Nilsen to strangle them. There was Carl Sutter and Paul Nobbs. Carl Sutter was the guy in the sleeping bag, and he recalled how Dennis had attempted to strangle him and then told him, you know, "I saved your life, I brought you back to life." The police inspector, DCI Peter J., he recounted the circumstances of Dennis's arrest and how calm and how matter-of-fact Dennis was. He also read some statements that Dennis had said. These statements included, "I have no tears for my victims, I have no tears for myself. nor those bereaved by my actions. It was a pretty big trial. I think it lasted a couple of weeks. They even had someone do a psychology test on Dennis to see how his mental state was. But eventually, Dennis was found guilty on the 3rd of November 1983 for 6 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder. The jury was unanimous and he was sentenced to life in prison with a 25-year minimum recommendation. After that, Dennis was transferred to Wormwood Scrubs to start his prison sentence, and he was a Category A prisoner, so this meant he had his own cell and he could freely mix with other prisoners. In December 1983, Dennis was cut in the face and the chest by a razor blade from another inmate. The inmate was called Albert Moffat, and this resulted in Dennis having to get 89 stitches. So the minimum of the 25 years recommended sentence that he got was actually changed in 1983 by a whole life tariff by Home Secretary Michael Howland. So in prison, you know, you don't just sit in your cell all day, you're allowed to like go out and mingle with people, and they have like little workshops to do. Dennis, in his prison workshop, he translated books into Braille. He spent a lot of his time reading and writing. He was allowed to paint, he was allowed to compose music on a keyboard, and he exchanged numerous letters to people who sought his correspondence. Like, there are so many people who want to send letters to serial killers for some weird reason. So on the 10th of May 2018, Dennis was taken to York Hospital after complaining about really severe stomach pains. So Dennis was found to have a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. So this was repaired by doctors, but later Dennis suffered a blood clot, which people think was some sort of complication that happened with the surgery. Dennis ended up dying on the 12th of May 2018 from some sort of hemorrhage. And that is it. This was a pretty big story today, so thank you for bearing with if you made it to the end. I really enjoyed learning about the life and crimes of Dennis Nilsen, and I'm super looking forward to the David Tennant TV show that will be coming out. I hope you enjoyed this video as best as you could, considering it's a nasty story. But yeah, I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!